The night began with lights, laughter, and applause. Yet Sandra Bullock felt an emptiness that no sound could fill. She stood under the grand chandeliers of a charity gala in New York, smiling for cameras, greeting people, and pretending that her heart wasn't breaking inside. The event was to honor artists who had supported families after a massive storm. But tonight, Sandra carried a storm of her own. Just hours earlier, she had received a quiet message that one of her oldest friends, someone who had stood by her when no one else did, had passed away. She had decided not to tell anyone. She didn't want sympathy. She wanted silence. The cameras followed her every move, yet none could see the tears she was hiding behind her gentle smile. When the speeches ended and the hall emptied, Sandra stepped out into the cool night air. The city lights shimmered on wet streets after a light drizzle, and her reflection looked like someone she barely recognized. The wind carried a chill, and for the first time in years, she felt alone. She walked toward her car, heels clicking against the pavement. As she opened the door, the engine refused to start. She tried again, but it only made a dull sound. The rain began again, softly at first, then harder, soaking her dress and hair. She sat still for a moment, clutching the steering wheel, feeling the world closing in around her. The rain washed away her makeup, but not her sorrow. A taxi passed, then another, but none stopped. Her phone showed 1% battery, and before she could even search for help, the screen went black. The street was quiet, and the gala hall behind her had gone dark. For a moment, it felt like the whole city had forgotten her. She leaned against the car, letting the rain fall over her face, whispering to herself, "I'm okay. I'm okay." But she wasn't. Suddenly, the faint sound of an engine echoed from the distance. A headlight cut through the mist. A motorcycle approached slowly, its tires slicing through puddles. The rider stopped a few feet away from her, turned off the engine, and removed the helmet. Even through the blur of rain, she recognized that calm face, those kind eyes. It was Keanu Reeves. He didn't speak. He simply stepped closer and offered her his jacket. It was warm and heavy, carrying the faint scent of rain and leather. Sandra looked at him, confused but comforted. "How did you know I was here?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. Instead, he held up an umbrella and opened it over her head. His silence wasn't cold. It was understanding, the kind of silence that doesn't need to explain itself. Sandra felt her breath steadying as the rain softened around them. Keanu looked toward the city lights, then turned back and motioned for her to come with him. She hesitated for a second, then nodded. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was trust. Either way, she followed. He led her to his motorcycle, helped her with the spare helmet, and waited until she was ready. When the engine started again, the city noise faded behind them. They rode through empty streets, past closed cafes and glowing streetlights that painted golden lines on the wet asphalt. Sandra held on to him gently, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, wondering where he was taking her. Minutes passed in quiet. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft rhythm of rain against their helmets. There was no conversation, yet she felt a strange calm. Somehow she knew she was exactly where she needed to be. After what felt like an hour, they stopped in front of a small building glowing with warm light. It wasn't a hotel or a restaurant, but something more humble. A sign read, "The Light of Tomorrow." Keanu turned off the engine and removed his helmet. Sandra followed, her heart beating fast with curiosity. Laughter and faint music came from inside. He opened the door and gestured for her to enter first. The air inside was filled with the scent of fresh paint and cookies. Sandra looked around and froze. Children were painting colorful murals on the walls, volunteers were serving food, and soft smiles filled the room. It was a shelter, a safe place for kids who had lost their homes in storms. A young girl ran up to them, her hands covered in blue paint. She looked at Keanu with a bright smile and said, "You came back, mister." Keanu smiled gently and patted her head. Sandra stood still, her eyes wide with surprise. "They know you?" she whispered. Keanu nodded slightly, still silent. The girl looked up at Sandra and asked, "Are you the lady from the movie about hope?" Sandra smiled weakly, kneeling beside her. "Yes, maybe," she said softly. The girl giggled and held out her hand, showing a tiny paper heart. "He told us to make these whenever we feel scared. He said kindness makes fear smaller." Sandra looked at Keanu again, her throat tight with emotion. "You told them that?" she asked. He gave a faint smile but said nothing. Volunteers greeted them warmly, offering tea and towels. The children went back to painting the walls with bright suns and blue skies. One section of the wall had words written in colorful letters. "We are not forgotten." Sandra touched the wall gently, her fingers trembling. It felt like walking into a dream she didn't know she had. She turned to Keanu again and whispered, "Why did you bring me here?" He looked at the children, then back at her. For a moment, he seemed to search for words, but instead, he just said softly, "You needed light." That was all. No long speech, no grand gesture, just truth. As they sat together watching the children paint, Sandra felt her pain begin to ease. She realized this place wasn't just a shelter for them. It was a shelter for her, too. And somehow, Keanu had known that. The night grew quieter. The rain slowed outside, and the city lights blurred through the windows. Sandra wrapped the jacket tighter around her shoulders and whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Keanu looked at her gently and replied in his calm voice, "You weren't lost." She smiled faintly, tears filling her eyes. For the first time that night, she didn't feel alone. What began as a moment of despair was slowly turning into a memory she would never forget. And as she watched Keanu help a child reach the top of the mural, she realized something deeper. Sometimes, the people who speak the least understand the most. This was the night she would later call the night of silent kindness. The night when words were not needed, because hearts spoke for themselves. The rain had softened to a gentle mist outside the small community center. Sandra Bullock stood near the window watching droplets race down the glass. The city beyond seemed distant, wrapped in a blanket of calm. Behind her, the children continued painting, their laughter echoing like fragile music through the hall. Every sound felt alive, like the world was gently breathing again after a long storm. Keanu Reeves sat quietly on a wooden bench, drying his gloves. He had barely spoken a word since they arrived, yet his silence carried a strange warmth. Every time Sandra glanced his way, she felt a quiet reassurance, as if his presence itself said, "You are safe now." She had worked with countless people throughout her life, but there was something different about him tonight. It wasn't the famous actor or the friend from years ago she saw. It was a man who seemed to carry calm wherever he went. A small boy approached her, holding a paper lantern painted with stars. "Miss Sandra, can you help me light this?" he asked shyly. She knelt beside him, smiling softly. "Of course," she said, lighting the small candle inside. The boy's eyes lit up as the flame flickered to life. "He said every light means someone cares," the boy whispered. "Is that true?" Sandra looked at Keanu, who watched quietly from across the room, his eyes kind but distant. She nodded. "Yes, that's true. Sometimes the smallest light can mean the biggest thing." When the children finished their art, a volunteer gathered them for bedtime. Sandra helped arrange blankets while Keanu checked the doors and windows. One little girl tugged at his sleeve. "Mister, will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. Keanu smiled gently and said, "Always." The girl hugged his leg before running to her sleeping mat. Sandra watched the moment with quiet wonder. She had seen him play heroes in films, but this was real. There was no audience, no applause, only kindness that asked for nothing in return. As the night deepened, Sandra sat at a small wooden table sipping tea. Keanu joined her, placing a cup in front of himself. The clock on the wall ticked softly between them. For a while, neither spoke. It was a silence that didn't need filling. Finally, she asked, "How long have you been doing this?" He looked up slowly. "A few years," he said simply. "The storms left a lot of children without homes. Someone needed to make sure they still smiled." She nodded, her heart tightening. "But why keep it a secret?" Keanu gave a faint smile. "Because kindness doesn't need an audience." His words hit her deeper than she expected. She had spent much of her life under bright lights on screens in front of crowds. Everything she did was seen, judged, celebrated. Yet here, in this small room with no cameras, she felt more human than she had in years. The rain outside stopped completely. Soft moonlight filtered through the windows, falling across the murals. Sandra noticed one painting in particular, a large tree with hands drawn as leaves. She walked closer. At the bottom of the trunk were two names written in tiny letters, Sandra and Keanu. She turned back, surprised. "Did you paint this?" she asked. He shook his head. "The kids did. They said every strong tree needs roots and shade. They wanted to thank both of us." Her lips trembled. "But I didn't do anything." He looked at her for a moment, eyes steady. "You inspired them without knowing. One of your early donations started this place." Her heart stopped. "What?" she whispered. He nodded. "Years ago, before this building existed, your name appeared on a small fund for storm survivors. You didn't use your real name, but they traced it back. You helped build the first home here. I just continued what you started." She covered her mouth, overwhelmed. She remembered the moment clearly now. A small donation she had made quietly after reading a news story about children displaced by floods. She had told no one. She never imagined it would turn into this. Her eyes filled with tears. "You kept it alive all these years?" Keanu's tone stayed calm. "Not just me. People who believe in kindness kept it alive. I just tried to make sure it never faded." For a moment, Sandra couldn't speak. She turned back toward the sleeping children, their faces peaceful under the soft glow of lanterns. Every small smile, every painted wall, every warm blanket, all of it existed because of something she had done long ago, without realizing its reach. A quiet warmth spread through her chest. She wasn't grieving anymore. She was remembering. After a while, Keanu stood and began cleaning the paintbrushes left on the tables. Sandra joined him without saying a word. Together, they washed the brushes and placed them neatly to dry. Their movements were simple, calm, and wordless, two people who understood that peace often lives in the smallest actions. When they finished, Sandra leaned against the counter and said softly, "You know, people think strength means never breaking. But tonight I think it means allowing yourself to be saved." Keanu looked at her with quiet respect. Sometimes it means showing up when someone needs silence more than words. Their eyes met for a brief moment. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't scripted, it was human. Two hearts recognizing that kindness is the language of those who truly listen. As dawn approached, the first rays of light entered the hall. The murals looked brighter, and the children began to stir. Sandra helped serve them breakfast, laughing as they teased her about spilling milk. The heaviness in her chest had lifted completely. Before leaving, she looked around one last time. Every child waved goodbye, and she promised to return. Keanu placed his jacket over her shoulders again and walked her to the bike. As she put on the helmet, she asked, "Where to next?" He smiled faintly. "You'll see." They rode through the waking city as the sun rose behind the buildings. Sandra held on to him, not with fear, but with trust. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew it mattered. This was no longer just a night of sadness. It was the beginning of something that would change her understanding of kindness forever. The morning sky stretched in shades of gold and silver as the motorcycle moved quietly through the waking city. Sandra Bullock held on to Keanu Reeves, her mind still lost in the memories of the night. The city that had felt so cold hours ago now looked alive again. People opened shops, children hurried to school, and the world seemed to breathe gently after the storm of her heart had passed. They rode in silence for a long time. Sandra felt safe but curious. She didn't ask where they were going because something about Keanu's calm told her the answer would reveal itself when it was meant to. The sound of the engine mixed with the soft hum of morning birds, and the rhythm of the ride almost felt like a heartbeat guiding her somewhere important. Finally, Keanu slowed down and turned toward a quiet part of the city. They stopped near a narrow street filled with old brick buildings. Many of them were worn and cracked, yet alive with color. Local artists had painted murals of hope, kindness, and dreams all along the walls. Sandra stepped off the bike, looking around in awe. "What is this place?" she asked softly. Keanu removed his helmet and looked at her with gentle eyes. "This," he said, "is where it began." He pointed toward a small cafe at the corner. It looked simple, almost forgotten, with a faded sign that read the Dawn House. Its windows were lined with photos of smiling faces. Children, families, volunteers. As they entered, A bell above the door rang softly, and a woman behind the counter looked up with surprise. "You came back?" the woman said warmly. She looked at Sandra, her face lighting up. "And you brought her?" Sandra frowned slightly, confused. "Me?" the woman nodded. "Yes, the woman whose kindness helped us start all this." Sandra looked at Keanu, startled. He smiled faintly and gestured toward a wall covered in photographs. She walked closer and froze. In the center was a framed newspaper clipping from years ago, an article about a young actress donating her first major paycheck to rebuild homes for flood victims. The face was hers. The photo was old, from a time when she was still new to fame, full of hope and nerves. She turned back to Keanu, speechless. I had forgotten about this." He nodded slowly. "But kindness never forgets where it came from." She touched the photo gently, her eyes stinging. It felt like a reflection of a younger version of herself she had lost in the noise of success. She remembered that time clearly now, when she had promised herself she would use her voice for good, not just for fame. But over the years, work and life had pulled her in many directions, and those early promises had faded quietly into the background. The woman at the counter brought them tea and sat beside them. "You might not remember," she said to Sandra, "but that small donation helped us build this cafe. It became a place where storm victims could eat for free and artists could work for shelter. Keanu found us later and helped expand it into the center you saw last night." Sandra's throat tightened. "You both turned one simple act into something that saved lives." Keanu shook his head gently. "We just followed the path you lit years ago." For a moment, the world around her seemed to slow down. The sound of cups clinking, the soft chatter of customers, the laughter of a child near the door. Everything felt alive again, like her soul was waking up. She realized she hadn't felt this sense of purpose in a very long time. As they finished their tea, the cafe owner handed Sandra a small wooden token carved with the word hope. She smiled and said, "Every person who helps here carries one of these. They remind us that kindness is a circle, not a straight line." Sandra held it tightly in her hand, feeling its rough edges and warmth. Keanu stood and said quietly, "There's one more place you need to see." They walked down the street together, past old walls painted with stories of loss and recovery. Finally, they reached a narrow alley where a group of young people were fixing bicycles for children. One of them waved at Keanu and shouted, "Hey, our quiet hero's back!" The group laughed. Sandra smiled at the nickname. "Quiet hero?" she teased. Keanu shrugged with a modest grin. "I didn't give them that name." One boy, maybe 18, approached and said, "He helps us every week. We fix bikes for kids who can't afford new ones. He never tells anyone who he is. We only found out by accident when a volunteer recognized him." Sandra looked at Keanu with admiration. "So this is what you do when no one's watching?" He looked back at the boy and said softly, "It's not about being seen. It's about seeing others." The boy smiled and went back to work, and Sandra stood still, her heart swelling with respect. She had seen countless people give money or fame to causes, but what Keanu gave was presence. Quiet, humble, steady presence. As they continued walking, the city noises faded again. Sandra noticed they were near the river. Sunlight danced on the surface, and she felt a strange peace return. They stopped at a small bridge overlooking the water. "Last night," she said slowly, "I thought I had lost everything. But you reminded me that I never really lost what mattered." Keanu nodded. "Sometimes people think kindness disappears, but it only waits for the right moment to return." She looked down at the water, watching ripples form with every gust of wind. "Why did you come last night?" she asked softly. "How did you even know?" He smiled faintly but didn't answer immediately. Then, after a pause, he said, "Because when someone once showed me kindness, it taught me to notice when others need it. I just saw the signs." Sandra turned to face him, eyes filled with emotion. "You saw me drowning in silence?" she whispered. He shook his head gently. "I saw you remembering who you are." The wind blew softly through her hair, and for the first time in a long while, she felt whole again. Not as an actress, not as a celebrity, but as a human being who once believed in the quiet power of doing good. They stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The world moved around them, but time seemed to slow just for that moment. As they left the bridge, Keanu turned toward her and said, "There's one last place I want you to visit. It's important." She nodded, trusting him completely now. Wherever this path led, she knew it wasn't just about helping others anymore. It was about rediscovering the forgotten light within herself. As they rode off again into the golden morning, she held the wooden token tightly in her hand. It was warm, as if carrying the pulse of every soul touched by kindness. She didn't know what waited ahead, but her heart told her the journey was far from over. This was not just the night Keanu appeared without a word. It was becoming the story of how silence can heal, guide, and remind us that compassion never dies. The day had grown quiet by the time Keanu and Sandra reached the edge of the city. The road stretched into open hills where the air smelled of grass and distant rain. The sky was turning soft and golden, and Sandra could feel the warmth of the sun against her face as the motorcycle slowed to a stop beside an old building that looked half hidden behind wildflowers. It wasn't a fancy place. It was simple and calm, a mix of weathered wood and stone with vines climbing the walls. The sign near the entrance read, "Haven Home." A few children played near the gate, their laughter echoing softly through the open fields. Sandra felt something stir inside her the moment she saw it, though she couldn't explain why. Keanu parked the bike and removed his helmet. His calm eyes met hers, and he said quietly, "This is where it all began." She looked at him, puzzled. "The shelter from last night?" He shook his head. "No, this is the very first place your kindness ever touched." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer yet. Instead, he opened the wooden gate, and they walked together down the narrow path lined with painted stones. Each stone carried a name or a word: hope, courage, love, thank you. As Sandra walked, she realized each name belonged to someone who had once been helped by this home. They stepped into a wide courtyard where women were hanging clothes and young boys were planting flowers. The air felt peaceful, like time had slowed down here. A woman in her 60s looked up from watering the plants and smiled warmly. "Keanu," she said softly, "you finally brought her." Sandra froze. "Brought me?" she asked. The woman walked closer, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've been waiting for you for a long time, my dear." Sandra blinked, unsure. "Waiting for me?" The woman nodded kindly. "You may not remember, but years ago, a donation came from a young actress who wanted to help rebuild this home after the flood. That gift saved dozens of lives. The woman behind that act was you." Sandra's eyes widened as a wave of emotion rushed through her. She whispered, "I had no idea it was this place." Keanu's voice was soft beside her. "You didn't just donate. You planted the seed of hope that grew into everything you saw last night." Tears welled in her eyes. She looked around, the laughter, the murals, the life in this place, and realized she was standing in the heart of her own forgotten kindness. It felt overwhelming, humbling, and beautiful all at once. The woman led them inside. The rooms were small but filled with warmth. Children's drawings covered the walls, showing homes, sunshine, and people smiling. In one corner, an old photo hung above a small table. It showed the flood that had destroyed the area years ago. And beside it was another photo, the same place now. Rebuilt and full of life. The woman pointed at the photo and said, "Every person who came here after the storm carried your kindness forward. Even when we lost everything, we remembered the woman who cared for us without even knowing our names." Sandra felt her knees weaken. She sat down slowly, trying to take it all in. She had spent so many years chasing perfection, chasing projects, chasing moments. But this quiet place filled with life and gratitude was her truest legacy, and she hadn't even known it. Keanu knelt beside one of the children painting near the wall and helped him clean a brush. His movements were calm and natural, like he belonged here. Sandra watched him silently, noticing how every child seemed to trust him instantly. There was no distance between them, just gentleness. When the children went outside to play, Sandra turned to him and said quietly, "You could have told me all this before." He looked up from the brush, his tone calm. You wouldn't have felt it the same way if I had just told you. You needed to see it, to remember it with your own heart. She nodded slowly. He was right. If he had said it earlier, she might have smiled politely and moved on. But standing here, surrounded by people whose lives had changed because of a small act she had long forgotten, it changed something deep inside her. A little boy ran up and handed her a small clay figure. "Miss Sandra," he said proudly, "we made this to thank you." She took it gently. It was shaped like a heart with small wings on its sides. "It's beautiful," she said softly. The boy smiled. "We call it the heart that never stops flying. Because kindness doesn't stop, it just finds new wings." Her hands trembled slightly as she held it. She looked at Keanu, who smiled quietly, letting her feel the moment without interrupting it. Later, as the sun dipped low, the woman invited them to stay for dinner. They sat on long benches outside, eating simple food cooked by the volunteers. Laughter and stories filled the air. Sandra listened to the children talk about their dreams. One wanted to be a teacher, another a doctor. Another said he wanted to build homes for people who lost theirs. Each dream carried the echo of a single act of kindness that had started long ago. As the stars began to appear, Sandra walked toward the edge of the courtyard. She stood there watching the children chase fireflies. Keanu joined her silently. Neither of them spoke for a long time. The sound of laughter mixed with the crickets, and for the first time in many years, Sandra felt truly peaceful. "I think I forgot who I was meant to be," she whispered at last. Keanu's voice was calm, steady. "You never forgot. You just got too busy being someone for the world. Tonight, you found the person you were for yourself." She turned to him, her eyes full of emotion. "And you? How did you even know about all this?" He looked at the glowing horizon, his tone gentle. "I met someone here years ago before I was famous. She told me about a young woman who gave everything to help strangers. She said that act changed her faith in humanity. I never forgot the story." He looked at her then and added, "I didn't know until recently that the woman was you." Her breath caught again. The pieces of the night slowly connected. She realized that maybe this was never a coincidence. Maybe kindness had been leading them both to this moment for years, weaving invisible threads between their lives until they finally crossed again. The stars shone brighter, and she whispered, "Maybe kindness has its own way of bringing people together." Keanu nodded. "It always does." They stood there quietly under the starlit sky, surrounded by the laughter of the lives she had unknowingly touched. For the first time in years, Sandra didn't feel like she needed to be seen or understood. She just felt grateful to be here to remember, to witness the quiet power of what one good act could become, and as the night deepened, she knew this was only the beginning of something even greater. The stars shimmered gently above the quiet hills as Sandra and Keanu prepared to leave Haven home. The laughter of the children still echoed behind them, and Sandra kept glancing back, her heart heavy but full. She felt as if she was leaving a part of herself there, one she had forgotten but finally found again. They rode back toward the city, the cool wind brushing against their faces. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was peaceful. It carried everything that didn't need to be said. As they entered the city, the lights grew brighter, but something in Sandra had changed. The noise of life no longer felt heavy, it felt alive. She watched people rushing across streets and thought about how many hidden kindnesses might exist among them. Acts no one ever notices, yet still powerful enough to change lives. Keanu stopped the bike near a tall glass building downtown. Sandra looked up, confused. "What is this place?" He smiled softly. "Something you'll understand soon." They went inside. The lobby was quiet, filled with photographs of volunteers and families. At the center stood a large wall engraved with hundreds of small names. Sandra walked closer, tracing her fingers across the names until one line made her freeze. Foundation built from the kindness of one forgotten gift. Underneath it was a simple inscription. Dedicated to Sandra Bullock, for showing that one act of kindness can light 1,000 hearts. She covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. People walking by smiled knowingly. Keanu watched quietly from a few steps away. This was the shocking truth she hadn't expected. The shelter she had visited, the children she met, even Haven Home, were all part of a network that her first donation had unknowingly created over the years. Keanu had been helping it grow quietly, piece by piece, never taking credit. Sandra turned toward him, overwhelmed. "You built this in my name? Why didn't you tell me?" He shook his head gently. "It wasn't built in your name. It was built because of your heart." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "You remembered when I forgot?" His eyes softened. "You gave the world light. I just made sure it never went out." The moment felt still, almost sacred. She looked around the hall again, realizing that this wasn't about fame or recognition or even charity. It was about love. Silent, selfless love that never needed applause. As the lights reflected off the glass walls, Sandra whispered, "You came that night because you knew I needed to remember who I was." Keanu smiled faintly. "No," he said quietly. "I came because kindness remembers all of us, even when we forget ourselves." And in that moment, she finally understood. Sometimes the people who appear without a word are the ones who speak the loudest through their actions. The rain began to fall again outside, but this time it felt gentle, like a blessing. She looked out the window, the city shimmering under soft light, and smiled. The night that began in silence had become the night her heart learned to speak again. The rain outside grew softer, almost like a whisper of peace after a storm. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves stood side by side inside the foundation hall, surrounded by walls glowing with the light of kindness. It was late, but the moment didn't belong to time. It belonged to memory, gratitude, and quiet truth. Sandra looked around, her eyes still damp. Every face in the photos, every name on the wall, every small act of hope, it all traced back to something she had done without expecting anything in return. And it had multiplied into thousands of acts she had never seen. She turned to Keanu, her voice trembling but full of warmth. "I spent years thinking success meant being seen, but tonight I learned that the greatest success is being remembered through kindness." Keanu nodded, his calm expression lit by the reflections around them. Fame fades. Kindness grows roots. That's the difference. They sat on a nearby bench, the sound of rain faintly tapping the glass. Neither said much for a while. The silence between them felt whole, not empty. It carried meaning, the way quiet music fills a heart without sound. After a long pause, Sandra asked softly, "Why didn't you tell me sooner? Why wait until tonight?" Keanu looked down, thinking, "Because sometimes words break what silence can heal. You didn't need someone to remind you who you were. You needed to feel it, to see it again through others." His words stayed in the air, heavy and gentle at once. Sandra realized then that Keanu hadn't come to comfort her as a friend or colleague. He had come as someone who understood the weight of grief, the power of quiet goodness, and the beauty of showing up when the world grows dark. They stood and walked out into the rain. The city lights shimmered like gold against the wet streets. A small group of volunteers were handing out warm meals to people without homes under a nearby bridge. Keanu walked over and started helping them without saying a word. Sandra followed. Together, they served food, shared blankets, and smiled softly at strangers who thanked them with tearful eyes. No cameras, no spotlights, no crowd, just real human hearts connecting under the same night sky. One little girl, holding her mother's hand, looked up at Sandra and said, "You're the lady from the big screens, right?" Sandra knelt down, smiling kindly. "Yes, I am." The girl handed her a paper flower and said, "Then why are you helping us in the rain?" Sandra looked at Keanu, who smiled quietly from a distance, and replied gently, "Because someone once helped me when I was standing in the rain, too." The girl hugged her tightly, and Sandra closed her eyes. That simple embrace felt more rewarding than any award she had ever received. Later, as the volunteers packed up, Keanu walked beside her toward the parked bike. The rain had stopped completely now. The air smelled of hope and wet earth. He handed her his jacket again, and she smiled, remembering that first moment when he appeared out of the darkness without a word. "You always seem to show up when people need you most," she said softly. Keanu looked up at the faint moonlight and replied, "That's what kindness taught me. It doesn't wait to be called." She nodded slowly, holding his gaze. "Thank you for reminding me who I used to be." He smiled faintly. "You never stopped being her. You just stopped looking." As the motorcycle roared to life, they rode through the quiet streets once more. The city, glowing in wet reflections, looked alive again. Sandra leaned slightly forward, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the wind carry her thoughts away. The road felt endless, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lost. She had found direction, not toward fame or success, but toward purpose. She realized that real kindness doesn't need an audience. It only needs a heart willing to listen when the world grows silent. By the time they reached her home, the clouds had cleared completely. The first light of dawn painted the sky pale orange. She removed the helmet and turned toward Keanu. There were no grand words, no promises, just quiet respect in their eyes. Before walking inside, she said softly, "You appeared without a word, but said everything I needed to hear." Keanu smiled, his tone warm and calm. "Sometimes silence carries the loudest truth." She stood on her porch, watching as he rode away down the empty street. The sound of the motorcycle faded into the morning breeze, leaving behind peace that felt eternal. Sandra looked at the small wooden token still in her hand, the one that read, "Hope." She placed it near her window, whispering, "This light will never fade again." And as the sun rose, painting the world in gold, she knew deep inside that the night she thought would break her had instead rebuilt her. Because on the night when she needed him the most, Keanu didn't come to save her. He came to remind her that kindness had always been her strength, waiting quietly to be seen again. That was the night when words were not needed, the night when silence spoke louder than anything else, the night when kindness became eternal.